Every single day, you're making choices in the digital world. And these choices have real legal and financial consequences. You click accept on some huge user agreement without reading it.
We all do.
And that dictates what happens to your photos, your documents, even your ideas. And then you're also participating in global markets where the assets didn't even exist a decade ago. It feels like we're all just constantly playing catch up.
Lot to track.
So we've taken the stack of sources you sent over everything from, the fine print on a major tech platform's user agreement to deep research on global finance and the history of what even defines a security. And we are diving in.
Right. And the mission today is really to give you a shortcut through all that complexity. How do these established, sometimes centuries-old legal systems even begin to grapple with this new wave of technology?
It's a massive friction point.
A huge one.
Yeah.
So we need to identify the key principles that are being redefined. We're talking about content ownership, the judicial flexibility needed to classify digital assets, and the ways we police multinational corporations that seem to operate everywhere and nowhere at the same time.
Okay, let's unpack that. I think we should start where most of us start and stop every single day.
Yeah.
That little checkbox. Accepting the terms of service. Our daily digital contract.
Exactly. And before we get into the power dynamics of that contract, we need to clarify some fundamental terms. The sources are really clear on this. This sets the stage for everything else.
Okay, so let's start with the big one. What exactly are we talking about when we say your content?
Well, the definition is intentionally massive. It covers anything you create, upload, submit, store, send, receive, or share using their services.
So everything.
Pretty much. Think about your entire digital footprint. The sources list examples like docs, sheets, slides you make, blog posts, maps, reviews, your Gmails, even your photos. If you put it on their servers, it's covered.
That's basically my entire intellectual life stored on their hardware. So when we talk about intellectual property, what specific rights are we actually dealing with here?
IP rights are the legal rights over creations of the mind. The sources break it down into the big four. Patents, copyrights, for your writing or photos, design rights, and trademarks, logos and names used in commerce.
And the one word that gets all the lawyers nervous? Liability. What are they trying to shield themselves from?
Liability is defined as broadly as you can imagine. It's losses from any legal claim against them.
Any claim.
And here's the crucial part. They specify that this includes claims based on contract or tort.
Just like a civil wrong, right?
Yeah.
Negligence and that sort of thing.
Exactly. Or, and I quote, any other reason. They're basically drawing the widest possible circle of protection around themselves.
A full spectrum defense. Okay, so my photos, my blog posts, they're protected by my IP rights. What happens the second I click accept? What license am I giving them?
You're giving them a worldwide, non-exclusive license.
Non-exclusive meaning I still own it.
You still own your content, yes. The license lets them use, host, store, reproduce, modify, create derivative works from it, communicate, publish, display, and distribute that content.
That sounds like they can do just about anything. Why do they need all that?
It really boils down to functional necessity. For them to actually operate the service, to literally run your documents or display your photos or send your emails, they have to have this license.
Yeah.
I mean, if you share a photo with a friend, they need the right to reproduce and display that image for that friend. If you use their cloud software, they need the right to store and modify it, maybe to resize images or compress files.
And the sources really draw a line here, right? This license is only for intellectual property rights. It doesn't touch your privacy rights.
Absolutely. That's a key distinction. And the license isn't unlimited. For example, if you provide factual information, like correcting a business address on maps, that's not covered because it's just common knowledge. The same goes for any feedback or suggestions you offer them.
Okay, so that's content control. What about user control? How easily can they just suspend your access or delete your entire account? This feels like where the power imbalance really hits home.
The terms lay out a few clear reasons. The main ones are if you materially or repeatedly breach their terms, if they're forced to by a court order.
The obvious stuff.
Right. And then there's the big one, if they reasonably believe your conduct causes harm or liability to someone else, a third party, or to the company itself.
And what counts as harm or liability?
The source material is specific here. It calls out things like hacking, phishing, harassing, spamming, misleading others, and, this is the big one, scraping content that doesn't belong to you. Those are the big red flags.
What if they want to change the terms? Do they just do it?
No. If the changes are material, they're obliged to give you reasonable advance notice and a chance to review them.
But there are exceptions.
A couple. The exceptions are for, say, a brand new service or feature, or in urgent situations, like preventing ongoing abuse or responding to a new legal requirement.
Which means the final choice is yours, but it's a tough one. The advice is simple. If you don't agree with the new terms, you have to take your content and leave. It's an all or nothing proposition.
It really is.
So we've seen how contract law is shaping our digital lives. But when money gets involved, the stakes just shoot way up and the regulatory challenges get, well, a lot more complicated. And that brings us to the classification puzzle of our time. Digital currency. Crypto.
It's the ultimate test of regulatory elasticity. We're asking old laws, primarily U.S. securities laws written decades ago, to handle assets that are just fundamentally new.
And that takes us straight to the famous Howey test. This is the core framework for figuring out if something is an investment contract and therefore a security that the feds can regulate.
And the key concept in that test, the thing you're always looking for, is a common enterprise.
Right, the idea that the investor's fortunes are interwoven with and dependent upon the efforts and success of the person seeking the investment or some other third party.
But the real story isn't the law itself, it's the yes. The judicial creativity needed to apply it to things that don't look like a stock or a bond. And that's where the source material points us to a fascinating figure, Judge Alfred T. Goodwin.
Goodwin was known as a prolific judge on the Oregon Supreme Court, very progressive, very interested in legal philosophy. He was a judge who knew the law sometimes had to stretch to achieve justice.
And you see him apply that idea to these wild financial schemes that were popping up. Take the Dare to be Great promotion.
Nicknamed Dare to be Greedy.
Exactly. It was Glenn Turner's multi-million-dollar pyramid scheme, selling motivational books and tapes. The guy was a total showman making a fortune, but at its core, it was a massive fraud.
And because it didn't look like a normal stock offering, it was hard to regulate. But Judge Goodwin saw the harm it was causing investors and just decided the law needed to be applied to kill it. He intentionally stretched the definition of a security to classify Turner's schemes as investment contracts.
That decision to stretch the law was everything. It let federal regulators step in and shut down a scam. And that single historical choice has huge implications for how we regulate ICOs today.
This flexibility is why the Howey test has lasted so long. And later, the Ninth Circuit clarified that this common enterprise thing can be satisfied in one of two ways: vertical pooling or horizontal pooling. This is a distinction that tricks up a lot of people in crypto.
Let's break that down. Horizontal pooling is the traditional model. All the investors' fortunes are literally pooled together in one fund. If the fund does well, everyone does well. Simple.
But vertical pooling is the trickier one.
Much trickier. Here, your fortune as an investor is tied directly to the promoter or the broker. If the promoter succeeds, you succeed, even if your money isn't technically mixed with other investors. This broader view lets regulators go after schemes where the ICO issuer, for example, is the central figure your success depends on.
So applying this framework to initial coin offerings, to ICOs, the sources break tokens down into three main types.
Right. First, you have currency tokens, like Bitcoin or Ether, mostly for transactions. Then you have utility tokens, which are about getting access to a product or service. The example given is the Munchie token, which was like an intermediary for restaurants and food reviewers.
And finally, the ones that get the most regulatory attention, investment tokens. These are specifically designed to promise some kind of payback or return on investment.
The clearest case for being a security. But even with all these categories, the fundamental nature of something like Bitcoin is still a challenge. Sources point out that its legal status is uncertain. In common law, is it incorporeal property? In civil law, is it a real or personal right? Nobody fully agrees.
And that ambiguity forces governments to pick a side. Some countries have just banned virtual financing altogether.
Right, to avoid the risk.
But then you have places like France trying to become hubs for innovation, considering things like an optional visa system or a whitelist for legitimate actors. They're trying to find a balance.
And these regulations have teeth. We see it every time there's a major enforcement action. You don't have to be a huge founder to get in trouble. The sources bring up Kim Kardashian paying over $1 million for a crypto touting violation.
A clear message to celebrities not to promote these things without proper disclosure.
It's a very loud message that regulators are serious.
That's a perfect pivot from individual assets to international finance. I mean, if it's this hard to regulate a single digital asset, how in the world do you police a multinational multinational corporation that operates in 50 different countries at once, how do you hold them accountable without just destroying the company?
That's where we see the rise of negotiated settlements, specifically deferred prosecution agreements, or DPAs, and also NPAs, non-prosecution agreements.
So these are basically deals where a firm gets sanctioned, usually with a massive fine, but they avoid a formal criminal conviction.
Exactly. They avoid the collateral damage, like getting debarred or losing licenses, which could be a death sentence for the company.
The goal is to get them to cooperate.
Right. The whole idea, which was formalized in policies like the 2003 Thompson Memo in the U.S., is to incentivize companies to self-report, clean house, and bill a huge fine instead of fighting it out in court. It provides certainty for everyone.
And you really see how necessary this is in big global cases. The sources point to the Rolls-Royce case.
A classic example. The bribery schemes were so widespread that a coordinated resolution was the only option. Rolls-Royce had to enter into DPAs in 3 different jurisdictions: the U.S., the UK, and Brazil.
Which must have been incredibly complex.
Unbelievable. But it was necessary and ended up in an $800 million penalty. If the U.S. had just gone it alone, it might have imposed terms that made it impossible for the company to comply in the UK or Brazil.
And that gets to this piling on problem, where multiple governments all try to punish the same company for the same conduct. The DOJ actually has a policy to avoid this now.
They do. It explicitly encourages multi-jurisdictional cooperation to make sure penalties are fair and coordinated, not just redundant.
And that coordination is so needed because of these big vulnerabilities in the system, especially in places like the EU. The sources describe the enforcement of anti-money laundering rules as patchy and varied across different countries there.
That fragmentation is the weak spot. It creates a massive vulnerability, and it allows money launderers to do what's called jurisdiction shopping.
They just find the country with the weakest rules.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Move their dirty money through the easiest system. And this has led to really strong calls for tougher, uniform enforcement across the entire EU.
If we look just at sanctions, we see the US and EU often take very different approaches. The Venezuela sanctions are a great example of this.
A perfect one. The U.S. tends to use a broad economic sledgehammer. They targeted debt and equity transactions with the Venezuelan government, effectively cutting them off from American capital.
Whereas the EU's approach was much more targeted.
Much more. They focused on sectoral sanctions, banning sales of arms or surveillance tech, and on freezing the assets of specific individuals. They targeted 18 people they identified as being involved in human rights violations.
So a surgical strike on individuals versus a broader attack on the nation's finances.
Right. And that difference just highlights the whole challenge of global regulation. You're always trying to coordinate different legal philosophies, economic interests, and political goals.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it feels like we've hit 3 areas where the law is just constantly straining to keep up. First, contract law is governing our digital lives through these massive, non-negotiable licenses.
Then you have financial innovation, forcing judges to get creative. We saw how Judge Goodwin, stretching the Howey test decades ago, now allows regulators to classify things like crypto tokens as securities to protect you from fraud.
And finally, global governance, where regulators are using these complex tools, these DPAs, to manage corporate accountability across borders, trying to police crime without just using the blunt instrument of a criminal conviction.
And it all comes back to that core tension the source material identifies, this constant friction between legal systems and human ingenuity.
Right.
The documents note that even in federal tax law, where Congress writes incredibly detailed rules, the creativity and chutzpah of taxpayers and their advisors are outpacing the ability of the legislators to plug every hole in the dike.
That's the perfect way to frame it, that human ingenuity will always find a way around the written rule. That's the fundamental friction here. So if legal complexity and corporate creativity are always going to outpace the lawmakers, where do we draw the line? Where's the balance between regulatory clarity, protecting consumers, and the right to innovate?
That's the question.
Something for you to consider until our next deep dive.